I think I'd like to then invite our first speaker onto the stage. And so Matt, if you'd like to come up and you can be prepping. Our first speaker today is Matt Biilmann. Matt is the founder, one of the founders of Netlify. He's my boss, so I'm keen not to screw this next bit up. Matt and I have known each other for a while, certainly from long before I joined Netlify, and I've kind of observed the way that Matt's been leading a lot of the work at Netlify and creating all of these services that I was very excited to use, that really kind of brought the JAMstack to my attention. So I'm going to step out of the way, leave it to you. You good to go?
I'm good to go.
Good to go. Okay, please make him very welcome as he gets himself set. Yes? Excellent. Okay, Matt Biilmann, everyone.
Thank you. So, hello. As Phil just said, I'm Matt Biilmann. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Netlify. And it's really exciting to be here today at the first full-fledged JAMstack conference. It'll be, as Phil said, two kind of different days. Like tomorrow will be like the more traditional conference day, and today we wanted to put together like a bit more of an informal get-together of especially agency people to talk more shop about like how are we actually talking about the JAMstack, and both with each other, but also when we talk to clients or potential users and stakeholders. So fortunately, I've had a bit of experience in talking about the JAMstack for a while now. Back in November 2015, I wrote an article not talking about the JAMstack yet, but talking about static site generators and why static site generators are the next big thing. Wrote that in a magazine. How many here know Smashing Magazine? Almost everybody, right? Like, so obviously like Smashing Magazine at the time and still is like probably like the leading publication online for front-end developers and designers and agencies and so on. And Vitaly from Smashing asked me to write an article about this emerging space of static site generators. And I wrote this article, and at first when I wrote it, one of the big selling points, of course, was about the performance of static site generators, and I put in some words around that, but Vitaly pushed back and said like, hey, we need some more concrete examples of like, why would a statically generated site be faster than a highly cached and optimized WordPress site? So back then I took Smashing Magazine's own website, ran a performance test on it, then made it static and ran the same performance test and showed that it would be like something like 7 times faster globally. Put it back in the article and sent it to Vitaly expecting that this would go nowhere. But he just accepted those numbers and pushed out the article, and the article itself became really, really popular. And one of the most commented articles for them that year. So we started talking a lot more together about like that kind of performance and these kind of numbers. Would there be a way to make those real for Smashing Magazines? And obviously, like often these kind of performance talks when talking to clients can be really like a useful entry point. Smashing Magazine at the time was built like most websites are still today, right? Like it's a WordPress application running on a server. They had a lot of issues with maintenance around that. And apart from that, Smashing was not just a set of articles with 200,000 comments. Like it was also a shop running on Shopify, selling ebooks and printed books. It was an event site selling tickets. It was a job board written as a Ruby on Rails application. And they had this ambition of introducing the concept of memberships to their user base. So they had this traditional architecture of very big monolithic applications that had no way of being composed together, and where they just had to fake it by maintaining the same theme across all of the different properties. And then we started talking about, okay, so what would it take to make it in this new stack, and even what's this new stack even called, right? Like, it was around the time where we figured out also that when you're talking about a project like this, obviously, like, the term a static website doesn't really make sense, right? Because if you're talking to stakeholders and go and talk to them about a static website, they won't imagine something that has, like, interactive comments, that has e-commerce, that has job boards, that has sign-in, that has gated access, all of those things, right? And we had been spending all the while since the end of 2014, and so talking to different players in the space. Some of them are here today, is like Thomas Reynolds from Instrument that built Middleman, and Jeff Escalante from back then from Carrot, that also were early pioneers in really starting to build websites with this approach. And we all sort of ran into this issue of, like, a ton of words existing in the category around single page applications or static sites or decoupling front end and back end and so on, but no coherent vocabulary around, like, what do we actually call this architecture when we're talking to someone. And around the time when we really started talking seriously to Smashing Magazine, we started to really materialize this way of talking about a new stack that's essentially moved up a level, where before we used to have, like, the LAMP stack, and it was all about Linux, Apache, PHP, like the specific server, the web server, the operating system, the database, and so on, right? And the JAMstack is really about the components that are at a higher level, right? It's about the JavaScript that we deliver to the browser through markup, and it's about the APIs we talk to from the browser. It's no longer about these lower level components. And maybe initially it sounded a little crazy when we were talking about taking this whole project and moving it to this new stack, and looking at what it would look like. But in many ways, maybe what was crazy was this complex conglomerate of arcane architectures they had at the time, right? And this fairly cumbersome publishing model for monolithic applications, where running out changes across this system of a WordPress site with a ton of plugins and a lot of maintenance behind it, and a Shopify site and a Kirby site and so on, when with this layer of, like, load balancers and firewalls and databases and data centers, when what someone like Smashing Magazine, especially a developer-oriented and fast-moving and standard-setting magazine like them wanted, was more like the direct capability to publish without managing infrastructure. Similar to how we had seen at the time, like, the developer trends around mobile applications change from, like, again, having to build large infrastructures with multi-tier infrastructures to essentially shipping an app to your users, and then having, like, fairly clear defined APIs that those apps talk to. A lot of the JAMstack idea can be summed up in that kind of modern architecture, also making its way to the web, but without the critical, like, locked down gateway of an app store or anything like that, right? And obviously, like, one of the big selling points to Smashing Magazine, as I mentioned, was this idea of performance. This is actually a fun chart from another agency, a client that migrated over all of the Kardashians' websites to a JAMstack infrastructure. So this specific year was the result of moving Kylie Jenner from from a traditional like monolithic application to a JAMstack-based React app. But the pure performance benefit is sort of like kind of undersells the impact. If you look generally at development and development tools, there's like this aspect of the UX that targets our end users, right? And what's the experience for the people we are building for? And then there's the DX that's really the developer experience, that's about how do we work as developers and how do we get like better tooling and move faster. And I think one of the things that's made so many people excited about the JAMstack and also about what we've been working at with Netlify is that this uniquely solves for both at the same time. we take an architecture where we can really like decouple the front end and get it to live on a globally distributed network where we can push the limits for performance way higher. We take these modern JavaScript frameworks and these modern tools like Gatsby, and we get an out-of-the-box experience that's really great for end users. That's faster, that's more interactive than what we've been used to in the past. But at the same time, by embracing this as an architecture, we can also get a developer experience that's completely tied to the way we like to work in a Git-based setup, and without without worrying about infrastructure and publishing and setting up complex pipelines and so on. And some of the people that's been excited about this is like people like Tom Preston Werner. Like, I love this tweet from him. The prediction that within 5 years you'll build your next large-scale, fully featured web app with the JAMstack and deploy Netlify, just because we've kept seeing like how we can start from these like this workflow and this idea of distributing our pre-built front end on a global network, and then build more and more dynamic services around that, and take the barrier for what we can build in this way higher and higher. But of course, even with all the advantages, change is scary, and probably there's a bunch of myths that all of you, when you sit in agencies and talk to clients, will run into, and will be thinking about, okay, how can we as developer get to use this kind of tooling and get buy-in from stakeholders, even at clients or internally in the agency or at large enterprises, of like how do we build with this stack? So I'm going to talk just about a few of the myths around the stack that we've seen people run into. One of the big one is that it's like a big migration, that it's like either or, and you have to start like migrating everything from the ground up to a new architecture, which is always a really scary proposition, right? Like, all of us know how big rewrites can be extremely challenging and often goes wrong. But and also that like all of the experience changes, right? Like, it's not uncommon that you'll imagine like, oh, we built with this Git-based workflow with a tool like Gatsby or a tool like Hugo, and suddenly you imagine that everything looks like a scary terminal that end users are also going to have to write Markdown by hand and so on. And obviously, that wouldn't work for most cases, right? But we're just seeing the category around that maturing. Like, we have an open source project that's still in the early stages for when the content actually lives in a Git repository, that just can give like content editors a normal, non-scary UI to working with that content and translate every operation they do into Git commits. But we've also seen tools like headless WordPress. We have a really large amount of sites built with Netlify that uses WordPress still as the familiar content UI for content editors, and then just pulls in the content during the build phase and makes it available for developers to use within frameworks like React or Vue or anything that we're used to working with in a modern front-end stack, and just use it more as a content store. And then of course we've seen like partners like Contentful really raising the bar for what can you do if you really build like the content management UI from the ground up for around this idea of a decomposed headless stack where you have individual APIs solving very specific problems. And these tools can really be great at giving people a sense that this is not something scary and unfamiliar where suddenly they'll have to write Markdown files or something like that. There's robust content editing tooling that's very familiar to content editors. But another thing, even on the technical side, you can do a very low-key migration by starting one page at a time, essentially, right? There's no reason that if you have a big .com and you want to roll out a more efficient developer process that decouples the front end and the back end, that connects directly to a global network, that you have to do it all at once. One of the services we offer at Netlify is a product called our proxy service. And one of the features that this can give people is this capability to do a gradual migration from a traditional dynamic stack to a JAMstack setup. So I'm gonna try to take the risk of doing a quick live demo and hope the Wi-Fi works at the conference. So I found that this might be a relevant example page just now with there's been a couple of big days for red socks and red hats. And I took a look at the MLB page, and it's definitely not a full JAMstack page right now. If you judge from the load times, I ran some tests around it. So I'm gonna try to do a very simple like idea of how we could do a really basic migration to start replacing some of these pages with a JAMstack approach. And I've set out this little example repository proxy demo under Netlify. And in reality, the only thing that this repository has right now is just an underscore redirects file, which is our format for defining proxy rules and redirect rules. And all it has in it is this one little rule that just says, like, essentially forward everything in the site to the original MLB site. And I've set up a little deploy to Netlify button here. So I'm just gonna connect to GitHub and start a new deploy. So what it did here is it created a new repository in GitHub for me, and it linked this directly to Netlify. And now we published this file, right? And you can see the URL ended up being Hungry Euclid in this case. And we're essentially just proxying directly through to the MLB, right? So anything I do in this URL proxies through. It does so straight from the global delivery network. So there's no, like, I ran the same speed test against the original site and a site I just deployed like this and got exactly the same results. For some reason, that was probably a fluke. The Netlify deployed version scored a little better, perhaps because of the TLS connection happening closer to the end user, but in general, you should expect like the same performance. And what I want to do now is just go in and overwrite one of the pages here. So I'm just gonna go in and create a new file. Gonna make it just the main index HTML. And I cheated a little and made this file up front, so I didn't have to try to type the 25,000 lines of code that apparently makes up the index page of the MLB site right now. Not sure why, but so I'm gonna propose a little pull request with this new index file, and immediately Netlify picks up the change, runs the deploy. In this case, I'm not even using a build tool or anything, right? So it's pretty much just instant. And when I go here, we now see that the index page got served straight out of like the index file that we deployed in Netlify. And at the same time, all the assets, everything that's not part of the new static, like this new static front end, is just still proxied through, right? So all the JavaScript and so on works seamlessly. And if I go to the /Red Sox, right, like I'm still just proxying through. So it's a really powerful tool to think about starting to do these migrations page by page instead of having to do like some massive rewrite of everything. And we've seen some pretty big clients build out new workflows for the developers starting like this, essentially just setting up the build tool and the publishing pipeline, and immediately starting rolling out new specific parts of their sites. The other myth related to complex projects is that this stack is great for simple sites, but not for complex sites. A lot of people came into this maybe through using Jekyll for developer blogs or something like that, right? And today the whole ecosystem has just matured to a very different degree. We've seen Gatsby, who are with us today for the conference, also raise money around like the build side of things, and and built this really flexible tool that can pull in all kinds of different data sources through GraphQL, and then just give developers this framework for taking those different data sources, composing them with component-based architectures, and building great user experiences on top of them. We've seen tools like Hugo that can build something like 6,000 pages in a second, which means that you also can drastically scale the amount, like the amount of content you can pre-build up front without requiring talking to an API directly from the client. And then another myth that's partly true, right? Of course, you still require servers in some cases, right? But there's still this myth that but you can't build real applications in that way. Like the first one to bust that myth will be that the whole demo I just did on app.netlify.com is obviously like a React app deployed to Netlify. Like every part of our UI runs on Netlify but talks to our API. But the other thing is that we've seen this API part of the JAMstack really mature to this modern API economy, where today a lot of these tasks that you used to build yourself and you used to have a server for, today almost every one of them there's an API for that. And that process is accelerating, especially as we're getting good at building with an architecture where each API is more specialized. It also becomes more reusable, right? It's not that many years ago that every time we had to do payments, it was like a really cumbersome process of setting up payment providers and so on. And today we just pull in a JavaScript from Stripe. Search, like how many here has not like struggled with configuring internal search clusters and running complex search engines and so on. And today, in most of those cases, you'll probably get a much better and faster result by just pushing an index to Algolia and using them straight from the browser. Authentication and even persistence layers like FaunaDB is starting to emerge that have these properties where we can use them directly from our front-end applications without having to do our own infrastructure. And I think it's not too long before it's more rare than common to run your own environment. Just like today, it's more rare than it's common to have co-located infrastructure. It doesn't mean that all co-located infrastructure has gone away. It just means that we'll constantly see the barrier for which kind of projects are people building without essentially running any servers themselves, shifting to much more and more complex projects. The whole serverless function space is something we've really seen emerge as a glue layer between these different API services that allows like independent front-end teams with a JAMstack pipeline to just build more and more complex applications without actually ever having to spin up their own infrastructure, their own servers. And then the last myth is probably also that this is not like enterprise ready, or this is like not for really big enterprise companies or projects. And it's kind of true that the name around this stack is new, right? Like, and it's been a new way to talk about it, and the approach itself is also a more modern approach, but all the technology beneath it is really battle-tested, and we'll see, I'm sure, like, some of the speakers we have here today will also be talking about really big projects they've done probably even, like, a long time ago, built with this kind of approach, and the technology around it is maturing all the time. CDNs have been, obviously, has been one of the most enterprisey things, right? It used to be the other way around, that you couldn't use a CDN unless you were a big enterprise, right? Like, it's not that long ago that CDNs were only companies like Akamai that sold to very specific global organizations, and today we've seen like a democratization of this ability to deploy globally. And then the application delivery network that you really need to take advantage of like a fast build pipeline and proxying at the edge and so on. That's based on the same enterprise idea, that you actually want this global infrastructure and not a localized server in some data center somewhere. And while we might sometimes hear the, like, what's the on-premise story or something, like, no one would go and say, like, I want Akamai on-premise, right? Like, it's in general, big enterprises, when they have like an application they want to deliver, they want it distributed as far as possible and not brought into a specific data center. And then CI/CD based pipelines has also really been something, again, that was really big companies that needed change controls and abilities to roll back, abilities to do layered rollouts of features and so on. That's today just become democratized, but that still makes them just as relevant for big companies as they've always been. It's just that the barrier to entry has been lowered so much. And then at Netlify, one of the things we see the enterprises really caring deeply about is the whole multi-cloud story that becomes so much easier when you have this architecture where the front end is really decoupled from the back end, and where you can roll out that delivery layer across multiple different cloud providers. At Netlify, we currently deploy any site you roll out to our enterprise CDN across AWS, Google Compute, Rackspace, DigitalOcean, Host Virtual, Azure, and Alibaba. And that's just like happens out of the box without even having to think about it, which gives like huge benefit to the resilience and the global reach of the infrastructure. So to go back and summarize a bit how we can talk about the JAMstack and how we found it useful to talk about the JAMstack and why we're even talking about the JAMstack. Like one of the early things we saw was really, and this emerged again and again in conversations with our clients and with other pioneers in the space, was that the term static is just not very useful when you talk about it, because people constantly misunderstand what it means and think that it's the user experience that's static and not the pre-built component that you distribute across a network. So talking about pre-rendered apps or pre-built applications or decoupled infrastructure turned out to be much more useful, not as some kind of marketing gimmick, but really as a way of communicating what this architecture actually works like and what it's like. And again, instead of talking about really complex migrations from an existing stack to something completely new that will often scare people a lot, it can be really useful to see how can we just introduce like new tools into this change that makes life a lot easier for developers and makes the user experience a lot better for the end users, and do it in a gradual and step-by-step way. And the other thing is that we found that it doesn't really make sense to talk about this as some greenfield new thing that's come out of nothing, right? Like this, the JAMstack is mainly a way of putting a vocabulary around a set of architectural principles that a lot of people have been working on for a very long time, and that people have been building really big enterprise systems with, and that comes out of a lot of learnings from really big companies like, hey, you should use a CDN, you should have a CI/CD pipeline, you should have the ability to roll back, and you should separate services from one big monolith into individual microservices. So it's actually like more of the knowledge and learnings from that space that a lot of the companies and partners in this room has sort of taken and democratized and made available to even small teams of developers out of the box, and not some completely new invention that came out a year ago. So we're not the only ones talking about the JAMstack, and I hope this would serve like as a good introduction and tone setting to like why did we start talking about it in this way, and how do we convince clients and so on. The next talk we'll talk about the 3 types of clients you'll need to convince, and then we'll have a break and 2 more great talks from MLab and Contentful that sort of represents both the persistence, one of the players in the persistence space, and the leading players in the headless CMS space. So I hope this was a useful introduction, and that you'll have a great day here at the Agency Day, mix with each other, and also just figure out ways of talking about this internally and share your war stories from different agencies and different projects, and have a great conference tomorrow. Thank you so much.